Well, I'm hoping we're starting here. Well, welcome to Washington Policy Center's On the Go series. This is a series in which we tackle Olympia. We track Olympia. We tackle what's going on. In this case, the Washington Policy On the Go's focus is on transportation. Now, the way the event will work is we'll bring our research center director guests on. We'll have a interactive back and forth where I'll ask them a series of questions to get us kind of updated on the status of key issues in the legislature, and then we'll open it up to your questions. And I'd encourage you to, at any point during this broadcast, to insert your questions into the question bar on the side of your screen. It is in the Go2 webinar toolbox. There's a question place there. You just type it in at any time, and then we'll assemble those questions at the end, and we'll or interspersed during the interview portion. So if you have a question at any point, don't hesitate, just put it in there. We also today are going to get a brief update from our Center for Education Director, Liv Finne, who wants to update us on a couple of key education issues that are impacting Olympia. So I'd like to bring her forward right now to talk with her about what's happening in terms of education reform and issues like that are in Olympia. Liv, thank you. Great to see you.
Great to be here. Thank you, Dave. There's two. Go ahead.
Yeah, no. So let's start with charter schools. I know that there's big deadlines with charter schools. We talked about that before the legislative session started. Toward the end of last year, we knew that there has to be some changes for charter schools for them to thrive in Washington State. So where do we stand there with charter schools?
Well, there is a bill before the House Education Committee this Friday at 10 o'clock. It's House Bill 1195. It would extend the time frame for authorizing new charter schools. And if that bill does not pass, we will not be able to open new charter schools in Washington State. We'll have only about 17 out of the 40 that voters intended to open when we passed the initiative in 2012. And it would be a devastating blow to the families that want access to these charter schools, especially during this pandemic. So this is a very important bill. If you want to testify on this, you can go to our website and search for remote testimony rules. Jason has put up a great little blog which includes a link so you can easily find the link to testifying on these bills. And it's the House Education Committee this Friday at 10 o'clock, House Bill 1195.
So if this passes, then that would make it so that we could have additional charter schools in the future. It would extend the cap, so to speak. And we're not even at what the previous cap was, correct? I mean,
that's exactly right. That's exactly right.
And part of the problem with that was that charter schools don't get equal funding. So a lot of these schools were really struggling to get by because they start with the disadvantage of not getting the same level of commitment to students as traditional public schools do.
Well, it's ironic because these schools serve mostly low-income minority children, and they start out with a huge handicap. These schools have to don't get any capital funding, so they don't have any building support. They don't have about 20% of the funding that other schools get through the local levy funding. So they are really struggling to open, just to get through the process. It's difficult, a huge hurdle, and just to stay open is very difficult. So that's why we don't have as many as we should. And if we care about giving opportunities, education opportunities to children, especially in this pandemic, Dave, I mean, it's so important to give new options to families so they can get a good quality education. And charter schools in Washington State are providing that. It's a very important bill.
So if this bill were not to pass, let's say it doesn't pass this year and it doesn't pass next year, what we could be seeing is a slow strangulation of the charter school experiment in Washington State, because they're being denied funding for students. That'll continue to struggle. They'd be denied the ability to open in new places where maybe there's a better opportunity, being denied additional students to serve. So I can see where this is a existential threat to charter schools. Am I correct in that?
You are absolutely correct in that. If the charter sector is not allowed to grow and thrive, the remaining charter schools will slowly drop off because they don't have equal funding. And so we will be faced with being a state that has basically strangled that opportunity for children, before it could ever even before it could really take off. So it would be a tremendous blow. Remember when we passed charter schools, Washington came late to the party. We were 42nd in the nation to authorize charter schools, and the resistance from the established interests has grown against charter schools because they see families want to have that option. They see families leaving the traditional schools to get their children a better education opportunity that is available at charter schools. These charter schools are more nimble, more flexible. They're doing a great job. And so obviously, people who are not in the protecting the monopoly interest in the schools, the regular folk in Washington state want these schools to grow. So I'm hopeful because there are some Democrats that have joined on this bill, which shows that charter schools are being accepted even by the Democrats. So, we'll see what happens. The Union Democrats will oppose it. So it's a fight, as it always is.
Well, let's bring forward some additional reform opportunities that have arisen in the legislature. There is a school choice bill you wanted to update people about. Tell us about that.
Yes, there's Senator Schessler, who is a leader of Republicans in the Senate, has introduced a bill, Senate Bill 5200, which would create $15,000 in tax credit scholarships for families with special needs children and for foster care children, so they can find the best opportunities in learning in the private sector as well as the public sector if they want to use that money to pursue the best fit, the best school that fits the needs of their child. And that is very exciting because he introduced that bill last session and it didn't get a hearing. Now this year it's been given a hearing. So the Senate Education Committee will discuss it and we'll see if it proceeds, but the testimony on that will be at 8 o'clock this Friday morning before the Senate Education Committee. So that's an exciting development.
It's also notable, I think, for people who don't know that, foster kids frequently do not have anywhere close to the same educational outcomes. So a need for greater flexibility and non-traditional approaches with foster kids is particularly pronounced in the state. And I think that's recognized by all sides.
Oh, I think so. Foster children, as everyone knows, often bounce from home to home, and the only stability they could have would be in their school. And so having the option, if a caseworker for a foster care child had the option to use a scholarship to send their child to a caring private school, that would be the best result for that child. And we should give the people who are taking care of foster care children that option so that the children can have a much more consistent and caring and small and safe learning environment. Because putting foster care children in the rough and tumble of some of our urban schools is just undoes any good that the foster care family can provide the child. So it's very important to give these children more options, especially to go to private school.
Liv, any final words? Any final comments for us before I let you go and get to the main event?
Yes, I would just say that the pandemic has put on full display the inability of the public school system, the inflexibility, the rigid nature, bureaucratic nature of it. And it's shown all of us that parents need more options to educate their children. If we don't learn that lesson, we're going to leave a whole generation of children behind in their education. It's a serious matter. We need to push for more school choice. And this is National School Choice Week, by the way. Everybody can, there's a national movement for school choice. It's spreading across the country. We don't want to be left behind. Washington students deserve to have the same opportunities for learning that other students in other states are now getting.
Thank you, Liv. Great update. Now I'd like to bring forward Mariya Frost, our Cole Center for Transportation Director, as well as Todd Myers, our Center for the Environment Director. Todd's here because there's some overlap between Mariya and Todd's areas of expertise because of the nature of some of the fuel taxes and regulations that have been proposed. So we'll get into some of that here in a couple of minutes. First, Mariya, one of the biggest topics of the last couple of years, both at WPC's homepage and at our social media sites and elsewhere, has been the road usage charge, the mileage tax. And And this year is bound to be no exception. Is there any change in the status of the RUC tax, the mileage tax, and if so, what is it?
Yeah, thanks, Dave. So in the way of a little background, the Washington State Transportation Commission has led the effort in our state to study, test, and report back to the legislature on the feasibility of a road usage charge. A road usage charge would essentially replace the gas tax. So instead of paying a tax for every gallon of gas that you purchase at the pump, you pay a tax on every mile that you drive. There is no legislation at this time that imposes a road usage charge, though there is a resolution that I saw from Representative Young that would address a big part of the current debate, and that is how the money will be spent. And that's what I want to focus some of my comments on today. So there are multiple agencies and officials and nonprofits that have opposed 18th Amendment protection for road usage charge revenue, or have eyed a road usage charge as a way to impose congestion pricing on the public. The Washington State Transportation Commission opposes this. They both support 18th Amendment protection of a road usage charge, and they oppose using the road usage charge as a congestion pricing tool because it would conflict with their recommendations around privacy protection, since congestion pricing would require that you install a GPS transponder in your vehicle. We believe that if the road usage charge is intended to replace the gas tax, it should replicate the features of a gas tax, as the commission rightly recommends. And so that revenue should be dedicated to highways and should function as a true user fee, as the gas tax does. Now, if legislators fail to protect the revenue and divert the money for other uses like public transportation, it will be a general mileage tax, as you've called it, that may result in less money going towards roads. So to protect that money, you would have to offer a constitutional amendment. And that's what I mean when I say the 18th Amendment, which protects that money. So one of the great things that have happened in this last week that I want to make sure everybody's aware of is there has been a recent coalition letter from businesses, labor, and nonprofits, including the Washington Policy Center, which signed in support of 18th Amendment protection for any potential road usage charge. The letter doesn't support a road usage charge, it supports 18th Amendment protection of revenue if a road usage charge is ever considered or imposed. And this is really foundational. And so I want to just update you on that. And then, of course, apart from how the money is spent, we believe there are other issues that need to be addressed long before a road usage charge is on the table. And so that would include the reduction of construction costs in transportation, where they can be reduced, reducing administrative costs of a road usage charge, addressing privacy concerns. Fortunately, the commission received a federal grant through the Federal Highway Administration to do some additional research after the pilot project completed in 2018. There were some other issues that came up. So the grant will fund, a wider variety of activities, but some of those would include, understanding how a road usage charge would impact electric vehicles, autonomous vehicles, ride-sharing vehicles, identifying disparate impacts of a road usage charge on communities of color or low-income families or other populations, and then obviously testing other ways to submit mileage, reducing that high cost of administration, addressing privacy concerns, and so forth. So we are tracking it very closely. We're tracking, the commission's efforts with that grant. It's called Forward Drive. And then, of course, keeping our eye on any kind of legislation that might pop up. There was legislation that came up last year to impose a road usage charge on electric vehicles, but it died, and I'm kind of glad that it did, because I think it's just simply premature to consider that right now in light of the many other issues that need to be explored and addressed.
So right now the main issue is just what if it were to happen, where would the funding go? It's and there's attempts to try to protect it basically in the same fashion as the gas tax, correct?
Yeah, and I think that should be the first discussion that we have, not some afterthought.
Sure. Okay, well, let's move towards some of the budget proposals. Let's start with the governor's. The governor's budget proposal has a big impact on or transportation budget proposal is going to have a big impact on Washington drivers if enacted. Why don't you describe the impact of that for us? And Todd will give you a chance to do so as well, since there's some overlap here. Mariya, we'll start with you.
Yeah, so the governor's proposal does include $400 million per biennium to support preserving our roads and railways and ferries and bridges, and all of that is good. However, the governor has directed the Washington State Department of Transportation to pause certain capital expansion projects that have already been funded and have been promised to the public in connecting Washington, while prioritizing the following efforts that I want to note for you. So $724 million to meet the requirements of a federal court order to remove state-owned fish passage barriers, $190 million to convert ferries to hybrid electric and to build terminal charging stations, $20 million for bike and pedestrian facilities, $15 million to electrify transit systems, $5 million for regional mobility grant programs, which is basically like rural and small urban transit funding, and then $3.25 million to fund work on high-speed rail between Canada and Oregon, and $1.5 million to promote electric vehicle adoption. And so we believe, first of all, rather than spending more money to sustain modes that are right now very underutilized, like ferries and transit and passenger rail, or funding luxury green electrification projects, right? Electrifying ferries and transit. I think state officials should prioritize making our roads and bridges more resilient and reliable for people who increasingly depend on automobiles for travel. So the priority really should be to preserve and maintain what we have, and maintain our promises and commitments from previous transportation packages without imposing new tax burdens during what is an especially difficult time for many people in our state as a result of COVID. I definitely think that stalling projects to fund transit and rail systems and carbon reduction programs, I'm not saying those things are not important, I just don't think they're important right now.
So Todd, let's get your take, because obviously some of this goes into your area on the environment, and including the fish culvert situation. What do you think about the governor's proposal, and give us some insights?
Well, let's just start by laying the groundwork on all of the various proposals there are for carbon taxes, for what's called cap and trade, which is a form of carbon tax, and then the low carbon fuel standard. So as Mariya has been talking about, there is this proposal to increase gas taxes 18 cents a gallon, plus a CO2 tax of $15 per metric ton, which amounts to about 13.3 cents a gallon. That would go up to $25 a metric ton over the first 4 years, which is about 22 cents per gallon. So overall, between the gas tax and the CO2 tax, it starts at about 31 cents and then goes up to over 40 cents pretty rapidly. The other proposal that's out there is what's called a low carbon fuel standard. A low carbon fuel standard has been used in Oregon and California, and basically it requires anyone who sells either diesel or gasoline to reduce the carbon intensity of those fuels. I mentioned just the numbers of $15 per metric ton going up to $25 per metric ton. That doesn't mean a lot to people, but those prices are, that's 13 cents a gallon to 22 cents a gallon. The low carbon fuel standard is $200 per metric ton, so 10 times as expensive a way to reduce CO2 emissions as the carbon tax. You don't go to 100%, so it's a little bit complicated, but the way that would calculate to an 18 cent per gallon gas tax increase by 2028 using current prices. And then it would double by 2035. The money from that doesn't go to the state. It simply goes from companies that sell diesel and gas to people who are providing credits, carbon dioxide credits, renewable fuels, things like that. So while this is a huge cost, 18 cents per gallon, when it's fully implemented in 2028, none of that money goes to the state for roads, for fish culverts, for anything else. It's just all exchanged. There are a couple of other bills. One is the cap and trade bill, which the governor has proposed, which is similar to California. Their price right now is about $20 a metric ton. So that, again, would be about 18 cents a gallon gas tax increase. There's another bill called the Strong Bill, which is going to be released, which also has a CO2 tax in it that would increase, I think it's to $20 or $25 a metric ton. So there are lots of proposals to increase gas taxes and increase the price of gasoline. Some
Hey,
of
Todd,
these,
can I pause you there for a second, just for my own brain? When you say $20 to $25 per metric ton, what does that translate to in gallons, roughly?
so it's, when you hear metric ton, it's basically, it's almost 1-to-1 for cents per gallon, not quite. So $20 a metric ton is about 18 cents a gallon. $25 a metric ton is about 23 cents a gallon. So, you know, convert it to pennies per gallon and then slice a little bit off, and basically you're about right. So that's kind of how that is. But there are two reasons it's important. One is just the general cost. The second is, for those who claim that climate change is a crisis, we need to do things that get the most bang for the buck, that we're spending, that for every dollar we spend, we do the most good for the environment. A low carbon fuel standard costs $200 a metric ton. That is unbelievably expensive. There are plenty of things that can reduce a metric ton of CO2 for $10. So if your concern is reducing CO2 emissions, you should never support something that costs $200 a metric ton. Things that cost that much are more about special interests than they are about climate change. And that is unfortunately what we see with a lot of these bills, is that the tax increase is more important than reducing CO2 emissions. That is almost consistent throughout a lot of these bills. They sacrifice environmental effectiveness so that they can expand government and increase taxes.
That's just fascinating to me. I mean, we see this happen year after year. You know, there's similar things, I guess, that happen in various fields. Like, you know, you'd think transportation would focus on mobility, and it doesn't seem to very frequently. But let's take a look now at the House Democrat majority tax package. Obviously, Democrats have the majorities in both the House and the Senate. The House Democrats have their revenue package out, tax package out. Let's take a closer look at that. We'll start with you, Mariya.
Yeah, so Todd covered some of that. The House Democrat Caucus revenue package, which is different than the governor's proposed budget, is a $26 billion 16-year revenue package or tax plan that would result in Washingtonians paying about $1 in tax for every gallon of gas that they purchase at the pump. So Todd went through some of those numbers with you. Just in the way of background again, our current gas tax rate is at the state level is 49.4 cents per gallon. It's the 6th highest in the nation. Coupled with the federal gas tax rate of 18.4 cents per gallon, Washington drivers pay 67.8 cents in tax for every gallon of gas that you purchase. So this would bump that with the 18-cent increase to the gas tax and the carbon tax of about, I think it was 13 cents. That would bump it up to about 99.1 cents per gallon, which of course would increase each biennium due to the built-in carbon tax hikes and the automatic adjustments to the gas tax that would result from indexing the gas tax to inflation, which is actually another key part of the proposal, is indexing. So those are basically automatic increases to the gas tax. So that is significant. And that does not include the low carbon fuel standard impacts that Todd discussed if those were passed. Most of the money in the revenue package would pay for preservation and maintenance of highways and bridges, replacing culverts, funding state and local projects, but the plan also funds, like the governor's budget. You can see this is also a priority in the revenue package. It funds electrification and various carbon reduction initiatives. And so, again, while maintenance and preservation is really important and is rightly a priority, and electrification is definitely worth considering in the near future, most of the spending in the revenue package seems inappropriate given the devastating impact of the pandemic on our economy. The other thing I want to note is, as far as maintenance and preservation goes, you know, these are critical programs that the Washington State Department of Transportation manages. And, you know, as we continue to fund those programs, I think it's appropriate for the legislature to consider an updated audit, like a performance audit, or a review of how the Department of Transportation manages those funds to see if there are possible cost savings. So I think that would make sense. The last time there was a performance audit by the state auditor of the maintenance and preservation programs was in 2008. And the last time that the Joint Legislative Audit and Review Committee produced a report on the maintenance and preservation programs was in 2015. The legislature actually funded a study, a report. It was $243,000. And that was back in 2015. So I think we're definitely overdue for taking another look into how the Department of Transportation manages our dollars before we continue to give them more and more money for, again, what is a tremendous responsibility and obviously very important. So I would just submit that as an additional consideration when we talk about maintenance and preservation.
So if we were to take a look at the full, I mean, just there's so many different taxes and regulations that are going to have the effect of a tax, even if the money doesn't actually go to the state, as Todd pointed out. But it's difficult for me to assess how much this would, let's say these things passed realistically, you know, each of these things, and since it's you know, there's one party majorities in every branch of government, that seems like a reasonable possibility. What would that look like for a driver if these components passed all at once? What's the total amount we're talking about here?
Well, I think it's very unlikely that all of them would pass at once. So for instance, you would not pass the cap and trade bill and the strong bill at the same time, because they basically do the same thing in two different ways. You might pass the cap and trade bill and the low carbon fuel standard. They have done that in California. This is phenomenally weird because they focus on much the same thing. And in that case, you could get the 18 cents per gallon gas tax increase by 2028, plus an additional 18 cents a gallon for the cost of cap and trade. So it just depends on the mix of things that you choose. I would not be surprised if the Democrats tried to pass some form of carbon tax like the transportation bill or cap and trade plus the low carbon fuel standard. And so under either of those scenarios, you would see more than a 30 cent per gallon gas tax. Well, increase at the price of the pumps basically immediately. So that's what we're looking at.
And likely to increase in the years to come automatically. Is that,
and it would automatically increase? Yes, both the low carbon fuel standard would increase because the requirements get more strict as time goes on, which drive the prices up. And in the case of Representative Fye's bill, there is an automatic escalator both for the gas taxes and for the cost per metric ton of CO2.
And that's the scenario in which if they increase, that still means that the money wouldn't be going to fix roads or improve roads or expand roads or highways or diminish congestion. This is just that kind of trade-off situation. Am I right in that?
Yes, for the low carbon fuel standard, that would be true, not for the gas taxes.
Right.
But again, I think as Mariya has pointed out, any CO2 tax is not protected by the 18th Amendment. So it can be used for anything, right? It's just put into the general fund and they can just use it however they like. We do have a requirement. A judge has ruled that Washington State has to fix our fish culverts and open up those streams. That can be a good thing, but it can also be very expensive. So they have to find a way to deal with that. It is also worth remembering that we have a $1.8 billion reserve. Revenue has gone up dramatically. I think 19% in the current biennium we are in. I think 8% in the next one. We are not hurting for revenue. So simply the argument that we need to raise taxes to do all these things is interesting, because what it says is without taxes, we won't do them, which means they are the least important things, which I think is ironic, because if you say that improving fish culverts, which we're required to do by a court order, is important, you don't leave it for last. If you say we are facing a climate crisis, you don't leave those projects for last. And yet both of these things, that's what they're doing. They're saying, unless we get new taxes, we won't do these things. That's backwards.
And Mariya, you also pointed out that when the governor switched these priorities around, he's taking away promises that were directly made by and voted on by the people with the last revenue package, which, you know, when people are told this tax is going to fund X, and then you change the rules, like Lucy grabs the football from Charlie Brown on a regular basis, people start to suspect that maybe, you know, maybe the rules are going to change, you know, when I get up, when I start to play, so to speak. So
yeah, and that's pretty frustrating for people. I mean, this was an issue last year when 976 was still on the table. So lawmakers budgeted assuming that 976 would pass, and there were, you know, they did some things with the budget that I think should be reversed to provide additional funding in the motor vehicle fund, which funds a lot of these major construction capital expansion projects. So I think there are tools in their toolbox that they're not using and just kind of jumping on delaying projects before there's been any negotiation or looking at the options. I will say the pause list is significantly shorter than the one last year, but the projects are quite large.
real quick, go ahead, Todd.
To that real quickly, which is this makes it really hard to come to agreement on good policy. So in 2015 or 16, you can correct me, Mariya, there was the transportation package that was agreed to prohibited a low carbon fuel standard and said that if there was a low carbon fuel standard at some point in the future, that the money for multimodal would be put into roads, if I remember it correctly. But at any rate, it was an agreement that the transportation package would stand as long as there was no low carbon fuel standard. The low carbon fuel standard bill this year specifically undoes that agreement. So what happens then is that if you're trying to negotiate a deal today, you know that people in the future will say, well, I didn't agree to that, so I'm going to undo all of that. So it makes it very hard, whether it's a transportation package or an environmental policy or something else, to come to agreement with people who, you know, have already broken similar promises in the past. So for people like Mariya and I who are trying to come up with good policy, one of the pushback we get frequently is, okay, Todd, that's very nice, but what happens if one side breaks their promise and does what they want to do anyway? And we kind of have to shrug our shoulders and say, well, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it, but this is a good policy that we should support for now. So you can see how doing these sorts of things locks us into a pattern of bad policies and unfortunately, I think bad faith, and makes it very difficult to do things that we should agree that we want to do, like fix fish culverts, like improve mobility and roads. You know, we can support user fees on a variety of different things, but if we think user fees are then just going to be turned into a slush fund in the general fund, it makes it very difficult for us to support things that ideologically we would otherwise support.
I'm so glad you brought that up, Todd. I mean, this is so relevant. I mean, we saw this with I-405 tolls, right? Washington Policy Center is not opposed to tolls when they're done right. We are opposed to politicians making promises to the public breaking those promises, messing with statute, and not meeting their commitments. And so we have issues with the 405 toll lanes, obviously. And similarly with the road usage charge and the debate happening around there, we support user fees. We support, a clean, I like the idea of a per mile charge, but I don't know that there's any assurance for the public that that per mile charge won't be abused to fund other things, to infringe upon people's privacy. All of these concerns that people have are not developed out of nowhere. They come from years and years of feeling like we have trusted lawmakers to do one thing and they have done another. And so that's a great point, Todd, and it does make policy recommendations very, very difficult.
Okay, before we get to the many questions we have, and there are many questions coming in, I'd like to remind everybody you can ask a question at any time in the question function on the toolbox on usually the right-hand side of your screen, little gray box area there. It'll say questions. You can type it in. Some of you have asked education questions. I don't want to discourage that because we'll take those questions and give them to Liv and we'll get you an answer. But we're focused on transportation for the duration here. Before we get to those questions real quickly, Mariya, I just wanted to give you a chance to plug. Tomorrow we'll be releasing your latest study, and that's the post-COVID transportation reform publication. And why don't you tell us about that and who all was involved?
Yeah, so this is a publication that I worked on with transportation experts from all across the country. It's called Transportation and COVID-19, a state guide to policy and priorities. The authors on it include myself, Bob Poole from Reason, Baruch Feigenbaum, Mark Scribner, all those folks are from Reason Foundation, Randall O'Toole from Cato, and Wendell Cox, who recently did a fantastic study for the Washington Policy Center on how we can improve transportation in our region. The idea behind the publication was we were seeing obviously a lot of recommendations regarding transit funding and giving away lanes to other uses and different ways of advancing agendas that existed pre-COVID, taking advantage of COVID to kind of move them forward. And these are policies related to smart growth and things like that. So we thought, look, I think we need to be leaders on our end as well and propose solutions and a new way of looking at transportation policy in light of everything that has happened. There has been an unprecedented amount of uncertainty that has been introduced into everyday transportation operations and long-term transportation planning. And so, with reductions in commuting, reductions in transit use and other modes, it's really just unclear when travel will return to normal. And so this publication is intended to help guide state legislatures and state-based think tanks like ours as they navigate transportation policy during and after the COVID recovery. So we cover things like public-private partnerships, reinventing transit, reducing Amtrak subsidies, strengthening the user's pay principle, considering the role of working from home and how that's going to impact where people choose to live and how they travel, prioritizing the resilience of highways, and lastly, encouraging a permissive regulatory environment for future mobility. And so those are the chapters that we cover in this publication, and we really hope it's useful and serves as kind of a big picture lens that policymakers can look through at more specific policies.
All right, let's go straight to the questions. First question, what would be the best investment for the state to make to reduce the transportation sector's carbon emissions?
So I think the first problem is that you can't focus sector by sector. So one of the things that we hear is, well, transportation makes up the largest sort of single chunk of Washington State's CO2 emissions, so we have to focus on that sector to reduce CO2 emissions. What we need to focus on is the best way to reduce CO2 emissions overall, independent of sector. So I kill my garden every year. which means that I should not be relied upon to provide my own food. So what I do is I pay other people to grow food for me, like our ag director, Pam. She is much better suited to grow food than I am. In the same way, if we said, well, Todd, you have to grow your own food because you're responsible for this many calories per year, that would be ludicrous. So what we need to do is just to focus on the best way to reduce CO2 emissions overall. The ways to reduce CO2 emissions in transportation right now are relatively expensive, and other ways, such as capturing methane, which is a particularly potent greenhouse gas, from landfills and other places, is very inexpensive. Seattle City Light pays about $7 a metric ton for projects that they invest in to reduce CO2 emissions. Under those circumstances, if the best we can do to reduce transportation CO2 emissions is $200, we should never do them. We should focus on what does the job. Don't focus on sector by sector, focus on the bottom line, making environmental improvements. And whether it is CO2, whether it is clean water, whether it is clean air, you focus on those things that work rather than sort of narrow your focus to, okay, what is this company's role or this person or whatever else. That's the way to do it. And I wrote a letter to Governor Inslee recommending a number of different ways we could do this that I released in December. So if you go to our webpage, you can read my whole 5-page letter to Governor Inslee that outlines a number of these different things.
Next question, tobacco taxes are supposed to discourage smoking, although if they work, tax revenue goes down. Are there any legislators willing to admit that the gas tax increase is intended to be governmental behavior modification? Are there any legislators willing to admit that the gas tax increase is intended to reduce driving? Mariya, I'll leave that to you.
They're shy about that. They openly say we want to reduce vehicle miles traveled. Making reduction of vehicle miles traveled a target, they openly say we want to stop people from moving so much. So there are a variety of particular mechanisms. Increasing the cost of mobility is one of them, but it's not the only one that they're considering by far.
Yeah, and I guess I'm glad you mentioned that, Todd. I think they're looking at updating the vehicle miles traveled reduction targets by geographic region. I know that's a priority to reduce driving, but then also a priority for the state is to maintain our infrastructure, which is so key to our economy. And of course, that is funded by driving. And whether you have a gas tax in place or a road usage charge, you need people to drive in order to generate that money, in order to pay for that infrastructure. So I see that as a fundamental policy conflict with vehicle miles traveled reduction targets, which I think are a moral issue also, but that's probably a separate discussion.
Next question, should the state abandon its use of bonded toll revenues and use other funding sources instead?
I'm glad that question came up. There's a bill being heard today, sponsored by Senator King. I think it's Senate Bill 5232, that would not permit the bonding of express toll lane revenue, which was a big discussion topic last year. It would still allow bonding toll revenue from bridges, which is not express toll lanes. One argument I've heard is, well, the toll lanes are not generating a lot of revenue right now in light of everything that's going on, so it doesn't make a lot of sense to bond the revenue. From my perspective, last year, the reason we opposed bonding toll revenue on the express toll lanes is because we see a lot of problems with the express toll lanes. Not just the way that they were implemented, but the fact that they're failing to meet speed requirements, the fact that they depend on congestion worsening in the general purpose lanes in order to generate revenue for the state. We feel that bonding against express toll lane revenue really locks the state into maintaining congestion on I-405 in those general purpose lanes for people who can't afford to or don't choose to go into the express toll lanes. So as far as bonding toll revenue on 405, because I feel that the 405 toll lanes are so problematic, that's not something that we support. So I do see I see a good rationale for the bill that's being heard today.
The next question is really a comment to get your reaction to it, or reactions to it. Increasing the cost of operating in the transportation sector takes away capital from investing in the latest technology. That's more fuel and emission, and those technologies are more fuel and emission efficient. Forcing private sector transportation providers to extend the life of old technology is the worst thing that can be done. Your thoughts?
Oh my goodness. Todd, do you have any thoughts on that? I don't know where to begin.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct, because I think it's even worse than that, which is that what we end up seeing is not only do you, by increasing the costs of transportation or replacing what you have, you hang on, as the question indicates, you hang on to old technologies. But what we tend to see are as a narrow focus, right? Politicians focus on what they know and they favor those technologies, but what they don't know is what's next. So if you're trying to come up with a new technology that does something more efficiently, you not only have to have a good idea, capital investors, but you also have a lobbyist now because you have to get it included in whatever regulation there is. The best example of this is California with their electric vehicle requirement in the 1990s. They tried to impose mandates on the percentage of electric vehicles that would be in the market in the 1990s. Well, as we know, the market wasn't there. Here we are in 2020 and electric vehicles are still very expensive. So the market and the technology just wasn't ready in the 1990s. What was ready were hybrids from Toyota and Honda, but they weren't counted in the law because politicians didn't know what the heck a hybrid was. So finally, they changed the law in 2003, 3 years after they had been introduced in the United States, to include hybrids. So the problem with a lot of these rules is that they favor a particular vision of the future when politicians, and frankly everyone, is very bad at knowing what the future holds and predicting. And so then you have to go back and undo bad policies. What we see is that, you know, we're doing all of this light rail. I mean, light rail is another good example of where you do fixed rail, but now we're seeing with COVID, people are, you know, from home. We see on-demand transit, we see lots of ride sharing and lots of technologies and ways of doing things that essentially make fixed light rail obsolete before it's even started in some parts of our community.
Anything to add, Mariya? Or?
No, I don't have anything to add. That's really well said.
Okay. Next question. As part of the conversation around a potential road use tax, have they considered a kilowatt-hour tax delivered via vehicle industry standard connectors? That is the equivalent of a gas tax. If so, how could we go about getting that properly studied and proposed? And the questioner is happy to help if that's of interest.
You know, if the questioner could email me at mfrost@washingtonpolicy.org, I'd be happy to look into that and see. I have not heard of such a thing, but I can check with the commission to see if there's any work that has been done or if that could be looked into.
Okay.
I think what the questioner is asking is a couple of things, because there's two parts to gas and carbon taxes. The gas tax is just essentially a user tax to fund road maintenance and road usage and expansion because you are a car using the road. And it doesn't matter whether you are a Hummer or a Tesla, right? You're using the road, you're causing wear and tear. And so the kilowatt hour tax would be a way to charge people based on their use of the roads for cars in the way that we do the gas tax now. Currently, electric vehicles are charged a flat monthly or a flat annual fee when they renew to cover that sort of cost. The second part, though, is the CO2 tax, which is the cost on the externality, the impact of CO2. So a kilowatt hour in Washington State is essentially clean. We are 92% CO2 free in Washington State, on our way to 100% by essentially 2030. So you still have to charge electric vehicles for the impact they cause, but the way we use those taxes right now is for two things: for the road usage and for the environmental impact.
The next question. Bellevue is getting upwards of 30,000 unplanned for jobs from Amazon and Facebook alone. Google's adding thousands in Kirkland. All of these will feed into 405. In Virginia, they're executing a massive infrastructure plan for HQ2 while we are doing nothing new. How does WPC recommend we fund new infrastructure new infrastructure to support that new growth, if not with new revenue? Or do we just take these jobs for granted and hope for the best?
No, I think that's a great point. And I've been tracking, Bellevue's efforts on that front. I'm a member of the Eastside Transportation Association, which is committed to making sure that the 405 master plan is finished. And I'm aware of the list of projects that Bellevue is asking to be prioritized in order to make sure that all of that growth is accommodated. And we obviously would support that. I just don't know, and it's something I'm still thinking about. I don't know that this session, a virtual session during a pandemic, is the right time to push for new taxes to fund any kind of new projects, whether that be roads or transit. I feel conflicted because I understand that growth is happening now and has been happening. So I'm sorry my answer isn't more black and white, but the growth in Bellevue is absolutely significant, and those projects do need to be completed. I think the issue is timing and the ability of people to pay for those improvements.
Next question. Since the COVID-related restrictions have decreased travel and commuting, has there been a reduction in CO2 emissions? And if so, has this had a meaningful impact, slowing the damage of CO2 emissions? And if these significant changes haven't stunted the damage from CO2 emissions, what magnitude of reduction will we need to make for a successful impact?
Let me see if I can quickly pull up. It's a great question, and I in fact asked for the data from gas taxes, monthly reports from gas taxes, because each gallon of gas produces about 20 pounds of CO2. So if you know how many gallons of gas were used, you can actually figure out exactly what our CO2 emissions, and I'm not able to find it, but I did ask for it. And what we saw during the pandemic is emissions go way down and then sort of level off. And then in October, they were back to where they were in October of 2019. So people have begun traveling again. It'll be interesting to see what happened in December. I don't have the December data since we had more restrictions in November and December. So there was a reduction. But like I said, we have gone back to almost normal already, and I would expect that we would get at some point this year back to normal. So it set us back a little bit in terms of CO2 emissions, but not very much. And the targets the state has set require far more than what we did. You also see a slight reduction in electricity use in Washington State, but not very much because we're using electricity, but just at home. So the restrictions that are wanted by some of the environmental community are still going to have to go into effect. What we saw wasn't significant enough to change that. The problem is that the targets that they have set are totally unrealistic and unnecessary. They're basically trying to get us to zero emissions by 2050 to keep temperature increases to 2 degrees. William Nordhaus, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics 2 years ago for his work on climate economic modeling, says that that is a ridiculous target because you would have to spend a lot more to achieve the goal than you would get in benefit from achieving that goal. So you'd end up making yourself worse off. So unfortunately, I think the reduction that we've seen in the past year is not enough to offset any future restrictions, and it didn't get us very far toward the goals, knowing that those goals are frankly more costly than they need to be.
Next question, is there any possibility that the requirement to build ferries in the state can be changed to reduce the cost of buying new ferries? I should say building ferries in the state be changed to reduce the cost of buying new ferries, or will the Vigorous Shipyards Full Employment Act continue?
I don't have an answer to that right now. I know exactly what you're talking about. I'd have to look back into my notes. I'm aware of the issue. Dave, can you flag that one for me for email follow-up?
Sure.
Thanks.
In the Representative Fay spreadsheet, the $3.5 billion for culverts come from the gas tax revenue rather than the carbon fee revenue. How would you respond to that, Todd, specifically?
Well, the argument is that the culverts are associated with transportation projects, so they are essentially transportation maintenance, which under their interpretation would be allowed under the 18th Amendment. So that's the argument. There is an interesting story here, though, which is that I used to work at the State Department of Natural Resources. The Department of Natural Resources on state lands, and then private foresters were also required under the Forest and Fish Law to remove fish culverts by 2015. They beat the target. The reason they beat the target is because there was revenue from timber harvests to pay for those culvert removals. It was business, it was revenue, it was doing work that allowed the income. It was the free market that allowed those environmental improvements. Where we have failed is on the political side. Because as I said before, we're not prioritizing fixing salmon habitat and fish culverts with existing money. What the legislators are saying is we'll only prioritize fixing it if we get more taxes. Right? We want to use all the current taxes the way we want. We don't want to have to prioritize. We want to just get more taxes. And that's why we are so late in improving fish culverts on the political side, on the transportation side, but why we've already succeeded when it came to, forest lands that generated revenue.
Next question deals with what is the impact of the end of the Keystone Pipeline? Will that add gas diesel supply cost increases?
It's a really good question. I don't know that it will, in part because Washington State doesn't use much natural gas for electricity. So a lot of that natural gas is used for electrical generation in a way that we don't use it. So we won't feel that. We will feel the home heating, the heating costs potentially, and some maybe with oil. I think it will obviously have a price impact, but global supply and a variety of other things I think will swamp the cost. I think it's counterproductive for a variety of reasons. One is that we want natural gas prices actually to be low as a way to reduce CO2 emissions, primarily in the East Coast where they still use a lot of coal. We want to switch from coal to natural gas because natural gas emits half the CO2 per unit of energy as coal. So we don't want to increase the price of natural gas because, I think as one of the previous questions was, you just stick with the old bad technology that you have that's more polluting, which is coal. So I think it's counterproductive, not just sort of on union jobs and production of fuels, domestic fuels, but even on the environmental front.
Next question, what are the bill numbers for the gas tax, Lcfs, and the CO2 taxes?
So the revenue package from the House, sorry, I'm thinking of the governor's budget. So the governor's budget is House Bill 1135 and 1136. The revenue package from Representative Finne and the House Democrat caucus, I don't believe it has a bill number yet. Todd, do you have the bill numbers for the others?
I have the bill number for the low carbon fuel standard, which is 1091. That was passed out of the Environmental Committee last week. It is now in appropriations.
Okay. Next question for Todd. What work is being done by the legislature to encourage both baseload and renewable energy to meet their own goals for electrification of transportation / reduction of carbon sources?
Not sure I understand the question. Can you say it again?
Sure. What work is being done by the legislature to encourage both baseload and renewable energy to meet their own goals for electrification of transportation / reduction of carbon sources?
I don't think I'm not sure I'm getting the gist of the question, but there is a bill by Representative Mary Dye, who was the ranking Republican on the House Environment Committee, that would focus on making sure that electricity costs actually decline in the future, and that the number of outages decline in the future. One of the challenges with renewable energy is that it's intermittent. The sun, shines during the day, and in Washington State, wind tends to blow at midnight, 2 a.m. But peak demand is about 6 p.m. So just as we need electricity, the sun's going down and the wind hasn't kicked in. So her bill would actually look at how to reduce the costs of electricity as we have more intermittent renewables, and then also maintain a grid stability so that we have electricity when we need it. But with regard to electrification, I mean, utilities and other folks are really excited about requiring electrification of vehicles because it's a new market for them. So we are definitely going to see an increase in demand for electricity. And Mary Dye's bill tries to deal with that as one of the impacts, because as we get more electric cars, either through government mandates or just because the price comes down, just because the free market works, we're going to see more demand for electricity and more renewables.
Well, I want to respect your time and the time of everybody who joined us here. Those of you who've asked questions that were not answered, we'll try to get back to you via email. We'll track those questions, and we do appreciate you being involved and interacting with us. I want to remind you too, Mariya's new study is coming out tomorrow. Mariya, what's the name of the publication for tomorrow? Do you recall?
Transportation and COVID-19, a state guide to policies and priorities, I think.
Yeah, just rolls off the tongue, but it is actually a really exciting piece. And it's interesting that such a coalition of transportation analysts from around the country got together with Mariya and did this study. So it's well worth a read. That study will be published tomorrow morning, I think at about 7 a.m. So check out our website or social media pages, and you'll be able to read that. And it's an easy read too, because each chapter is fairly short, and the recommendations are very succinct. So you can learn something very quickly that way. That publication is again coming out tomorrow.
Those who love Mariya will be at their computers at 6:55 hitting refresh.
That's right. Well, they can subscribe to the feed, and they could get on board with that. I'm sure Mariya would be posting a short video on that publication tomorrow, just because I beg her to do that kind of thing from time to time to promote such things. But anyway, I want to thank you, Mariya Frost, our Cole Center for Transportation Director, for spending the time with us, and Todd Myers, our Center for the Environment Director. My name is David Bose. I'm the Communications Director for Washington Policy Center. I'd encourage you to check out our events page for next week. We'll have on Tuesday, same time, a Facebook Live event, our legislative lunchbox event hosted by Chris Cargill. And then the following week, we'll do another legislative update here using a similar kind of format that we did today. So check our events page. We do events like this every week, every Tuesday from noon to 1. Thanks so much for joining us.